Okay, hello everyone. My name's Evan Kidd. I'm coming to you from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, and I'm the moderator for today's talk. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Birgit Hellwig, who's going to talk today on language documentation, acquisition and socialization, widening the evidential base. I'll give you a brief introduction to Birgit, who is a linguist extraordinaire and who's now working on language acquisition, which is very lucky for our field. Birgit got her PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. She's held research positions at La Trobe University in Australia, and she's held academic positions as well in Germany at the University of Erfurt, and now is a Lichtenberg professor at the University of Cologne. She has a background in working on African languages in West Africa and also Northern Africa, and has more recently been working on a language in Papua New Guinea, which she'll be telling us about today, language being Kaket. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Birgit, who will be telling us all about language acquisition in the field. Thanks, Birgit.
Thank you, Evan, for this kind introduction. And thank you to the organizers for the invitation. I think it's a wonderful format, and I'm very much looking forward to the next 90 minutes or so. Let me just start the screen sharing. So you should be seeing my PowerPoint now. As you will see later on, the talk today builds on a joint effort by a number of people, and I just want to start by acknowledging them. So that's Shanley Allen, Lucy Davidson, Rebecca Defina, Barb Kelly, and Evan Kidd, who you've just seen and who has kindly agreed to be our moderator today. My talk today is set at the intersection of three research fields. So it's language documentation, where I come from myself. It's psycholinguistics, or more specifically language acquisition, and anthropology, more specifically language socialization. We'll start by a brief introduction to the empirical foundation of child language research. And then I discuss a proposal for widening this evidential base. And I will illustrate the potential of this proposal with a case study. I plan on talking for about 60 minutes or so that we have another 30 minutes for discussions and questions. So let's start with the empirical foundations. My talk is concerned with diversity, linguistic diversity, cultural diversity. And this chart is to remind us of this. So there's 7,000 plus languages spoken and signed around the world, and each of them presenting children with different tasks, different challenges, different opportunities for learning. And this diversity also presents a challenge to linguistics as a field. So the challenge is to show how the child's mind can learn and the adult's mind can use with approximately equal ease any one of this vast range of alternative systems, making it necessary to harness the linguistic diversity to answer questions such as, can different systems be acquired by the same learning strategies? Are learning rates really equivalent? And are some types of structure, in fact, easier to use? And the central task for us lies in finding an adequate answer to this challenge. And we have to ask ourselves how much of the world's diversity is actually represented in language acquisition research. And the immediate answer that comes to mind is that the field of language acquisition always had a strong cross-linguistic outlook. Yeah, so as Melissa Baumann here puts it, the goal of language acquisition research is to disentangle properties of children's early language that are universal, hence plausibly determined by the basic capacity for language acquisition, from properties that are shaped by the learning environment, and especially by exposure to a language with a specific structure. So given this goal, there is quite a long history and tradition of cross-linguistic research, especially because of some large-scale initiatives. So of course, there's Dan Slobin's cross-linguistic study of language acquisition. There's the Frog Story project on narrative development. There's language socialization within anthropology, or there's the Childers database. So on the face of it, it looks good. But if we take all the acquisition studies together, we know something about the acquisition of approximately 70 to 80 languages. So approximately 1% of all the languages spoken today. And this includes languages for which only one acquisition study of a single feature exists. So this estimate is about 10 years old, but recent systematic surveys come to similar conclusions. And I just want to show you the most recent and comprehensive such survey, which is a survey of all the papers published in 4 major acquisition journals since the 1970s. It's altogether more than 2,800 papers, representing data from around 100 languages. So that's in the order of 1 to 2% of the world's languages. And the figure that you see on the screen represents both good and bad news. So the good news is the studies are becoming more diverse over time. Yeah, you see in the 1970s, 1980s, it was an English-only discipline. That's the green curve you see there. And in the 2010s, there's almost equal proportions of English and other Indo-European languages, that's the orange curve, plus some more non-Indo-European languages, the purple curve. So essentially, the majority of studies is still on English. That's 54%, so over half of it. But the other half of studies are on languages other than English, 30% on other Indo-European languages, and about 16% on non-Indo-European languages. And the trend definitely goes towards more diversity. So that's the good news. But there's also bad news, both in the group of Indo-European languages and of non-Indo-European languages. There is a heavy skew towards the larger and better described languages. So that's here for Indo-European languages. The focus is clearly on the large Romance and Germanic languages. So aside from English, it's languages such as French, Spanish, German, Dutch, Italian that are well represented. And a very similar picture emerges among the non-Indo-European languages, which you see here. There are studies on 64 non-Indo-European languages from 25 language families. And the bulk comes from a handful of large languages with a large researcher base. Yeah, Hebrew, Mandarin, Japanese, Finnish, Korean, and so on. While the many small and under-researched and under-documented languages continue to be underrepresented, if they feature at all, then with 1 or 2 studies only. This is not new, and the behavioral sciences have coined the term of the weird populations, and our sample is very much biased towards these weird populations, or to be more specific, to a specific subsection of them. So this means that our sample is way too similar to each other. So the languages are related, they share typological features, they're spoken in similar language environments. And at the same time, our sample is very unusual from a worldwide perspective. It exhibits unusual typological features, and it's spoken in unusual environments. So overall, the sample does not reflect the diversity in the world. For language acquisition, this bias has serious consequences because the properties of individual language influence the course of development. It is therefore not surprising that the overall consensus is that we need acquisition data from many more languages, and especially from many more diverse languages. But this is not as easy as it sounds, because there's a considerable methodological challenge involved. It's captured in this quote here. These conditions, meaning these fieldwork conditions, often make it difficult to follow the best practice approaches to data collection which are commonly assumed in lab-based first language acquisition research. So there's quite a number of challenges here. Just think of many communities are located in a very remote region. There are often challenging environmental conditions, lack of infrastructure, limited technical experience, limited literacy, limited material available on the adult language, so limited descriptions, limited other resources. And this list can go on and on. But there is one central challenge, which is important for the talk today. And this challenge is the strict requirements on data collection, which are not easily transferable to a fieldwork context. There are considerable constraints in terms of the number of participating children, so their ages, their development, different background measures, in terms of recording, so how often to record, over which period, at which intervals, and in terms of the amounts of data needed. There are different opinions about the properties of a good acquisition corpus, but the overall consensus is that large amounts of data are needed. And we do need lots of data because of the peculiarities of child language. So essentially, in a nutshell, if a feature doesn't appear in my corpus, it does not mean that the child does not know it. It might simply be a gap in the database. And conversely, the presence of a feature in my corpus does not necessarily mean that the child knows it and uses it productively. It might simply be a rote-learned form. It might be an unanalyzed chunk. And sample size and sample density very crucially influence our ability to interpret the data, to draw conclusions about what the child knows or doesn't know, or about how the distribution, let's say, of a feature in the input influences its course of acquisition. The common proposal is therefore to record around 4 to 5 hours per month over longer periods, let's say 1 or 2 years, and for more than one child in order to be able to compare across individual children. And I just want to put this into perspective. If we adopt such a typical recording schedule and record something in the order of 1 hour per week or 4 to 5 hours per month over a period of 2 years, for only 2 children, this would add to 208 hours of recording, which is well beyond the capabilities of most of our fieldwork-based projects. And while this sounds like a lot of data, it represents only about 1% of what a child produces and hears. And in some cases, 1% sampling is not adequate to answer the question at hand. So even this huge amount of data may not be always enough for all research questions. The question then is how to handle this dilemma. So yeah, on the one hand, we urgently need data from a larger number of languages. We need to extend language acquisition research to many more languages. But on the other hand, the need for large data sets combined with the methodological challenges makes it highly unlikely that we will be able to significantly increase coverage. And the field needs to seriously engage with the question of how we can best balance these two needs. And there are different ways of balancing these two needs. So one way is to target the depth of coverage, to support the creation of large-scale acquisition corpora for more diverse languages. And there's absolutely no doubt that we need such corpora, but it is also clear that the number of such corpora will continue to remain small. And another way, or complementary way, is to target the breadth of coverage to create smaller corpora. These smaller corpora will have limitations, and we'll see some of the limitations during this talk. So they can only answer a limited number of questions, but they will be much more feasible to construct and thus increase the likelihood that we can extend acquisition research to a large number of languages. And recent years have seen a number of highly interesting and highly important proposals that balance the depth and breadth of coverage in different ways. So I think the most comprehensive such approach is Sabine Stoll's active project at the University of Zurich, which essentially revolves around the in-depth study of selected languages that are representative of the diversity of the world. Another approach is very much tied to the work of Casillas and Cristia, who show the potential of creating and analyzing day-long recordings that especially give us insights into the kind of input that children receive. And the most recent such proposal is Clifton Pye's developing toolkit for collecting acquisition data on indigenous languages. So all these approaches are very different in many respects, but all have a similar point of departure. So they build on the advances of language documentation over the past 20 years. And the idea is to create databases that have multiple uses that are of use to the field of language acquisition. Yeah, the goal is to be able to base our theories of learning on a more representative sample of the world's languages, but also to the field of language documentation, because documenting language use by children and with children falls within the scope of language documentation, which is to create a comprehensive record of the linguistic practices characteristic of a given speech community, which includes children. It is also likely that this approach will lead to a better understanding of language transmission in the context of language endangerment or language shift, which then can contribute to maintenance and revitalization efforts and can give insights, for instance, into communicative practices that support language learning in the community. And child language documentation is also very likely to give us insights into the structure of the adult language. Yeah, so as such, documenting child language has multiple benefits for all fields. And in this talk, I want to flesh out a specific proposal, a specific approach within the context of language documentation. This is the sketch acquisition project. The idea here is to harness the potential of language documentation, the expertise of language documentation in fieldwork-based research, and to integrate documentation with language acquisition and socialization. And the focus is on creating corpora, small corpora of manageable size, plus an acquisition sketch. And the core group of this proposal consists of the 6 people that you see here, plus another 20 or so associated researchers coming from all 3 fields of language documentation, acquisition, and socialization. The cornerstones of this project are a workshop series. So we're aiming for 1 to 2 workshops per year. We got stalled by Corona, but hope to take this up again. A sketch manual, essentially instructions, suggestions for corpus construction and sketch writing. The possibility of archiving the corpus and of publishing the sketches. And we're currently setting all this up and piloting the approach in a number of languages, and will hopefully launch everything by the end of the year. Our sketch project revolves around 5 hours of analyzed corpus data out of 10 hours of recording altogether, distributed over 5 different ages. So children at age 2, 2 and 6 months, 3, 3 and 6 months, and 4, with 2 children, and recording each child for 60 minutes at each age and analyzing 30 minutes. So that's what this table shows. We allow for different scenarios. The ideal case is a longitudinal setup. So the same 2 children recorded at these 5 different age points. That's what you see in the table. But we're very much aware that this scenario may not be possible in many field sites, and so also allow for other kinds of alternatives. And this table here illustrates such an alternative, the so-called cross-legged approach, where 4 children are recorded and each of them at 2 or 3 different time points. Altogether, we have 5 hours of analyzed data, and it is clear that these sketches, sketch corpora, are not the same as full-fledged acquisition corpora. Yeah, so they do not target the depth of coverage. They are not in-depth acquisition studies, but they are sketches, and that's also the name, sketch acquisition, and as such aim to increase the breadth of coverage to extend acquisition research to as many languages as possible. And for the rest of this talk, I want to give you some idea of the potential of the sketch format. Yeah, so I do this by means of a case study. The case study is on Kharkit, which is a Binding language, a Papuan language that is spoken in Papua New Guinea by about 15,000 people. Kharkit is spoken over a vast area. Essentially, it's in two different types of settings. So there is the remote setting in the remote mountains where people are highly mobile. They lead a subsistence-based lifestyle with slash and burn agriculture and supplemented by hunting. People live in a fairly homogeneous setting in the remote regions with very few outsiders present. And Kharkit there is the dominant language, and children grow up with Kharkit as their first language. And all the examples that you will see later in this presentation come from this remote setting. But just to put this into perspective, Kharkit is also spoken in a second kind of setting, in the more accessible regions along the coast, where there's a road and where people work on plantations and planting cash crops. The setting there is much more heterogeneous. There's many settlers from different parts of Papua New Guinea, many interethnic marriages, and Kharkit is still spoken there in Kharkit families, but the national lingua franca, which is Tok Pisin, is the dominant language, and children, at the moment, Kharkit children grow up with both languages from an early age on, and Tok Pisin will probably replace Kharkit there in the not too distant future. Our project is a full acquisition project. It runs over 8 years. It's a longitudinal study with 4 families. We're focusing on children between the ages of 2 and 4, plus their older and younger siblings, who are video recorded 1 hour a week by their parents. And they aim to collect or record natural interaction between children or between adults and children. This results, as you can see here on the screen, in a very large corpus. The recording phase is completed, but annotation is still underway. So just to be clear, this is a dedicated acquisition project. So it's not the target for a sketch format. The target group for a sketch format are language documenters who want to integrate child language into their documentation work. And so what I've done is, from this large corpus, I compiled a sketch corpus that we'll talk about today. The sketch corpus, or some salient properties of the sketch corpus, are summarized here. As I said before, I've decided on the cross-legged approach. So 4 children, each at 2 to 3 time points. And I chose this approach because I think it's the most realistic type of corpus in a fieldwork context. And I stuck to the 5 hours of analyzed data, so 30 minutes per child per age. And just to give you an idea of the amount of data available, I to give you here the numbers for intonation units. So it's about 8,000 intonation units available, including about 2,500 from the focus children, plus utterances from interlocutors, especially from other children, but also from adults. So you see there's quite a good number of utterances available that can be analyzed. And in fact, the goal of the sketch corpus is to have as much language available as possible within the 5 hours. So, and there's both advantages and disadvantages to this goal. Yeah, so the advantage is there's a lot of data to analyze, but the disadvantage is also that the contents of the sketch corpus are biased towards certain types of interaction. And I could talk about several kinds of biases, but I want to illustrate this with one particular bias, and that's the interaction. So in particular, the sketch corpus contains very, very little multi-party interaction. We know from our anthropological research in that region and also from our larger longitudinal corpus, that children participate a lot in mixed groups of adults and children. Yeah, so adults interact with other adults, children are present, they sometimes tune into the conversation and participate, sometimes they tune out again and do their own thing. And such contexts are very rare in our sketch corpus, and which means that we can't use the sketch corpus to investigate how children interact in such contexts. And the absence of multi-party interaction in the sketch corpus reinforces an important point that that I try to highlight a few times during this talk. We should never think about the sketch corpus as being representative. We won't be able to capture everything. But there is quite a lot of peer interaction in the sketch corpus, which is a very common context for Kharkiv children. And especially there's a lot of child-directed interaction. And this is what I want to focus on now. So let's start with an example. This example is a short extract from a conversation between a mother and her two children, 2-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. They're all cleaning vegetables. And just before this extract, the 2-year-old daughter was upset, and the mother now tries to cheer her up. And she does so by distracting her. Yes, she talks about something that interests the child, in this case, going to the garden. And this is a very typical situation where adults and older siblings comfort younger children by distracting them. Let me just play this extract for you. Okay, I hope you were able to hear the sound. If not, Evan, you can give me let me know. But so this little extract exemplifies quite a few typical, perfect, thanks, Evan. Okay, so this little extract exemplifies quite a few typical properties of child-directed language. So first of all, we see a specific routine. It's the so-called tag question routine. This is this one here. So the child asks, "Da, true, really, is that right?" And the interlocutor responds with yes. This routine is extremely frequent in our data. And I mean, just to give you an idea, this table here comes from a larger corpus, so not just from the sketch corpus, showing the 10 most frequent utterances of 2-year-olds in the corpus. And you see it's interjections, general purpose questions, vocatives. And so they're all indicative of typical kinds of routines that children engage in at this age. And the tag question routine is overall the 4th most frequent routine, the most frequent utterance for the children. And in the sketch corpus too, we find many instances of this routine. And we have enough data to investigate the contexts in which it typically occurs. And it mainly serves to signal the child's engagement in the conversation, like we just seen here in this example. But it also occurs regularly in the context of word learning. And that's what we will see here in a second. It's a child interacting with her older brother. The older brother introduces a new word, that's hulavas tahu, so it's a kind of tahu. The child responds with the tag question, and the brother acknowledges it by saying yes. And then what happens is that the 2.5-year-old tries to repeat the word. And as you can see from the transcript here, she's very persistent, but not very successful. Let me just play this. Yeah, so this was one example, and I'll just show you another example that is similar but a bit different. It's a father interacting with his 2-year-old son, telling the son to close a box verbally. And the son first repeats the last part of the father's utterance and then follows this up with the tag question routine. So let me play this. Yeah, so both of these examples feature the tag question routine with children repeating parts of their interlocutor's utterances, essentially engaging in word learning. And what you see here is a highly frequent pattern in our sketch corpus. There's several such examples. And this routine is not only very frequent, but people are also very conscious of this routine. And this is the example that I give you here. The mother is trying to teach this routine to her 2-year-old daughter, essentially telling her to say da, to engage in the routine. And she's also enlisting the help of her older brother in this process, telling him to tell his sister to say da. Let me just play this.
Da. Da.
Yeah, so this routine is essentially employed with and by children. Adults use it too in adult-directed speech, but it's much less prevalent there. And in adult-directed speech, it does not trigger repetition, but simply a confirming interjection. And what we can also see in this little extract is another common pattern in car kid socialization, which is the communication of an adult with a young child through an older child. Yes, in this case, telling the older child to tell the younger child something. And this is something what we find frequently in mixed groups where adults preferably communicate with the oldest child present. Again, something that does become clear in the sketch corpus, but especially in our longitudinal corpus. Okay, but let's get back to our initial example, because we can observe a few further characteristic properties of child-directed language here. This is exaggerated prosody. So for example, the question intonation, which I play. Play this again. Yeah, so this rise, fall, pitch contour is typical for yes, no questions in car kid, but it tends to be much less clear in adult-directed speech. And here you can hear, and you can also see from the pitch curve that it's quite exaggerated. So the pitch starts at a very high frequency of about 220 hertz, rises considerably up to, 350 hertz about, and down again to 250 hertz. Oh, there's another example. You see that there's two identical utterances here. We can go to the garden, and I'll play them for you again. So the first utterance and the second utterance. Yeah, and you can possibly hear that the second one is longer. The speaker takes more time, and what you've probably definitely heard is that she emphasizes the last word. And again, this is not unusual in the data, much more careful pronunciation when talking with children, and especially at points when during the exchange when a child does not respond as intended. Another typical property of child-directed language we see in this extract are repetitions and variations. I've highlighted them in red and summarized them in this table here. So the mother repeats her utterance several times and she varies it. Yes, she adds and removes directionals, particles, prepositional phrases, subordinate clauses. But the core of the message remains the same. It's all about going to the garden. This phenomenon is very typical for child-directed language, and it is known in the literature by the term of variation sets. These are partial repetitions with changes in lexical items, grammatical morphology, and or word order, maintaining a constant communicative intent. Yeah, so the idea is the message is kept the same, but the language used to express the message varies. And these sets are documented for many different languages, different cultures, and they are highly frequent, and they're also very frequent and common in our sketch corpus. But we not only find variation in the input, You also find identical repetitions, and here's such an example. So the boy first utters 5 times look, or you look, and then adds 3 times move back from over there. Let me play this.
Yellow. 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 Yellow.
And both these varied repetitions and these identical or exact repetitions are very frequent in our sketch corpus. So roughly 35% of the input to the children in the sketch corpus consists of varied repetitions and about 12% of identical repetitions. That's quite a lot. And it's in fact more than what we find in our larger CARCID corpus. So here in the larger corpus, larger data set, the proportions are 21% varied repetitions and 10% identical repetitions. And this, I give you these 2 numbers to reinforce the point from earlier. So numbers in the sketch corpus have to be interpreted with caution. However, what the numbers also show is that both patterns, both varied and exact repetitions, are represented in the sketch corpus. So this means there is enough data for us to investigate their properties. When do people use them? For what function? When people change something, what is it that they change? How do children respond? So we can ask all these questions of the data set. Furthermore, the data in the sketch corpus shows another very salient pattern. And that is that much of the input is in the form of identical repetitions. So adults mainly produce varied repetitions and very few exact repetitions. And this is also true for a larger corpus. Yeah, so the numbers are very similar there. But children produce a lot of identical repetitions. And this is even more pronounced in a larger corpus. In a larger corpus, about half of the repetitions that a child produces are varied and the other half are exact. And this difference between adult and child interlocutors or adult and child language is relevant because children spend considerable amounts of time in the company of other children. This is true for many parts of the world, and it also holds true for CARCID. Yeah, so adults, as you can see here in this quote, adults spend a lot of time working in the garden, and they leave their younger children with their siblings, or slightly older siblings. And an important duty of older children is just to look after their younger siblings. And children as young as 4 years of age already look after babies for a short while, and 6-year-olds look after them for the whole day. And this also shows in our sketch corpus. Yeah? Children typically interact with their peers and less frequently with adults. And these proportions, so 65% of child speakers and 35% of adult speakers, adult interlocutors, are almost identical to the proportions in our larger corpus. And for many features, there are differences in how child interlocutors and how adult interlocutors use them, and there are differences in how they interact with young children. Yeah, so for repetition, we've just seen that adults produce more variation and children produce more identical repetitions. And it is an open question of what this means for language acquisition. So what is the effect of learning when children hear many exact repetitions and fewer varied repetitions? And just to be very clear at this point, the sketch corpus cannot answer these questions. We need other kinds of data to be able to answer these questions. But what the sketch corpus can do is it can raise, first of all, the hypothesis that children hear a considerable amount of exact repetitions, and it can ask the question of what this would mean for a theory of learning. Okay, so let's take a short step back here. So what I've done so far is I selected a small number of features of child-directed language that appear in our sketch corpus. I could have selected different features, so many more topics that show up in the sketch corpus, but the intention was mainly to provide a brief illustration of what is possible on the basis of 5 hours of data. And the question, of course, is how valid are the features that we detect in the sketch corpus? Yeah, so aren't they simply an artifact of the small corpus size? And I've already pointed to a few limitations throughout this presentation. For CARKID, fortunately, there exists a controlled study on child-directed language, where Henrike Frie in her PhD study systematically compared child-directed and adult-directed speech in the retelling of the pair story. Yeah, so adults told the same story, once to an adult and once to a child. And you see here a list of the differences she found between child-directed and adult-directed speech. And all these features are found in the sketch corpus. Yes, as I said, there are limitations, yes, in the sketch corpus. Numbers in the sketch data have to be interpreted with caution. There's not enough adult-directed speech available to attempt a comparison. But the strength of the sketch data is the richness of the data. Yeah, so all attested features show up in the data. And not only do they show up, but they also are very frequent. So it's very hard to miss them. And they can thus be identified, they can be investigated, they can be described, all on the basis of 5 hours of data. And this richness of the data makes it possible to address questions in the literature. So we do know that the register of child-directed language is well attested in the Western world, but there are still too few studies available outside of the Western world. So we know very little about the existence of this register and its features in the languages of the world. And such sketches can contribute to understanding of universality and variability in the domain of child-directed language. Yeah, so for example, what you see here is a comparison of some selected features of child-directed language across 4 languages of the Australia and Pacific region, all on the basis of sketch data. And you see there's already some similarities, some differences. And once enough sketches are available, we can begin to explore similarities and differences more systematically. So yeah, we can, for instance, compare the data within a region or within related languages. Okay, so far what we've done is we've looked at language to children, but of course the sketch corpus also contains language used by children. This here is an utterance by a 4-year-old from our sketch corpus, and you can see it is quite complex. Yeah, so what she does is she produces a conjunction, and CARKID has 5 different conjunctions available, so she has to choose one among these conjunctions. She also produces particles. So CARKID has about 40 such particles that can be combined in various, in specific orders. She produces a verb with a complex argument structure. So in this case, a 3-place predicate with all 3 arguments realized. This includes an unmarked recipient, the first person singular, and it includes a theme that is introduced by a preposition, whereby she has to choose the target preposition out of a set of altogether 13 prepositions that are available. She also has to pay attention to features of the predicate, so the form of the predicate. This includes the choice of subject index, which expresses tense. So she chooses here the neutral index instead of the non-past index, and the aspectual stem. So depending on the conjugation class, CARKID verbs have up to 5 different aspectual stems. What else does she do? She produces articles, choosing from 5 different definite and indefinite articles. She produces noun class morphology, choosing from 8 classes and 3 number categories. And she has to pay attention to morphophonological processes. Here it's the lenition of plosives. So T and K become R and R. But she also has to know that this lenition is blocked in aspectual stems, so that she has to apply lenition in some contexts, but not in others. And this is just a selection, small selection of the complexities of Kharkiv grammar that a child has to learn and that 4-year-olds are quite good at producing. And it's a long way from what we see in the 2-year-olds of our sketch corpus, where we observe a small vocabulary, single word utterances with little morphology. And what we can now do is we can use the sketch corpus to describe, to investigate and describe what the children do at the different ages. For example, we can look at the phonology. So the sketch will give us an idea of the difficult sounds. And to illustrate this potential, I'll give you some examples from the rhotics. Kharkiv distinguishes between an alveolar trill and a retroflex flap. And both of them are difficult for the children. And you see some typical pronunciations by children under the age of 2.5 from our sketch corpus, who tend to substitute these difficult sounds. And we are able to observe how older children and adults deal with such mispronunciations. And I'll give you an example where an older child attempts to teach a 2-year-old the correct pronunciation of the alveolar trill. We'll play this.
Yeah, R.
So you've heard there's quite a bit of laughter involved here. The older cousin imitates the wrong pronunciation and makes fun of it. And this is a very common reaction to mispronunciations by young children. The sketch corpus is full of such examples. Another very common reaction to mispronunciation is to joke about it, which you see here. So this is an example from the voiced stops. Kharkiv has a series of 3 voiced stops, and they are phonetically quite unusual in the sense that they have an unusually long closure period in the adult language. And this closure period is then, and speakers do maintain very strong voicing throughout this entire closure period, which they can achieve with prenasalization. And children have considerable difficulties acquiring these sounds, which we can see in this example. So here a 3-year-old attempts to say battery, but does not produce the expected long voicing period. And his mother makes fun of him, pretending that she understands Patrick instead of battery. So let me just play this.
Battery.
Battery. Battery. Battery. Makaraka Patrick. Mankolam Patrick. That battery.
Yeah, so the sketch data shows us which sounds are difficult at which ages. And also, maybe even more interestingly, they give us insights into how adults react to these non-target-like pronunciations. But the sketch data not only gives us information about phonology, but also about morphophonology. So in this case, I've given you an example from intervocalic voiceless plosives, which are lenited. So in this example, K becomes R. This happens very frequently in nouns because nouns are normally preceded by a vowel final article, and this article is obligatory in the adult language. But young children usually omit it. And likewise, adults interacting with young children omit the article too, or can omit the article. So here we see an example from the sketch corpus. A 2-year-old attempts to say sweet potato without the article. The mother takes this up and she gives the correct pronunciation of the root, but minus the article. And the omission of the article has consequences for the morphophonology. So if the article is missing, the initial plosive is not lenited. And this is one of the very few natural contexts where underlying plosives surface. Just play this. Yeah, and you can also see in this example that the older brother does produce the article, but he doesn't use the lenition correctly. So he says akukuka, and he should have said arukuka. This is something that becomes very clear in the sketch data. The acquisition of lenition is very protracted. And as I said, lenition can be frequently observed in nouns because they are in the adult language are usually preceded by an article. But in the child language, they are not always preceded by an article. These are the noun tokens from our sketch corpus, and you can see that the youngest age group usually omits the article. Older children usually produce target-like forms and also select from a large variety of articles, but not always. So even among the older children, there's still a good number of bare nouns without an article. So again, as I've said a few times, the numbers have to be interpreted with caution, but it is possible to form hypotheses on the basis of the sketch data. So it's possible to form the hypothesis that children start out with bare nouns, then produce the phonologically very simple and semantically very general noun marker R, and then start using the other articles. And this is indeed what we also will see in the larger corpus. And our final example now comes from morphology. Carcat has fairly complex noun and verb morphology, including the marking of noun class. So I just give you the paradigm here. There are 8 classes and 3 number categories. And the classes and numbers are marked on the noun and on quite a number of different agreement targets. And it takes a while for the children to produce this morphology. Here's an example. It's taken from a mother who repeatedly talks about a frog calling out in the distance. She essentially says the frog is calling. And in addition to the roots, she adds an article and a noun class suffix, the singular feminine class, and a subject index on the verb, which picks up the singular feminine class of the frog. Her son repeats what she says, essentially asking for confirmation that the frog is really calling out, but he omits the article as well as the noun class suffix, and it's not entirely clear whether he omits the subject index or not, but if it is present, it's only in a very rudimentary form. So let me play this. Yeah, so again, we can observe what the child is doing. So at this age 2, they frequently omit most of the morphology. And at later ages, we can observe how the morphology is gradually being produced. And we can also, again, observe what the adults are doing. They frequently expand on the child's utterance, modeling the correct form. Okay, so let me wrap up this. I've now illustrated some possibilities, both from the perspective of what children hear and from the perspective of what they produce. It is a small selection, and I could have chosen many other topics, but I hope that this selection served its purpose, essentially to give you an idea, an impression of what is possible on the basis of only 5 hours of data. The idea is to facilitate the collection of comparable cross-linguistic and cross-cultural data on language acquisition, and the focus is on natural language used by children and with children of similar ages. And the overall goal of this approach is to broaden our understanding of the problem space here. So children grow up in very different environments and contexts. These contexts present them with different opportunities for learning. They acquire very different languages, each presenting them with different challenges. And the sketches will help broaden our understanding of this variability. They allow us to raise topics and questions that can then be explored in the sketch data and may be tested in larger data sets. And they allow for comparisons across sketches. When doing this, we do have to keep in mind that it is a limited database, and this impacts on the kinds of things we can do with it. Yeah, so the approach is descriptive rather than explanatory. Yeah, so describing what children hear and what they do and what they say. And on this basis, we can then make inferences on what they may or may not know, but we have to exercise caution here. And the focus is on qualitative analysis, supplemented with descriptive statistics. The focus is not on rigorous quantitative analysis, although some high frequency phenomena may be amenable to statistical analysis. This remains to be seen if this is possible. But despite these limitations, there's a lot we can do on the basis of 5 hours of data, as I hope to have illustrated today. And essentially, this idea is not new. We're very much indebted to Dan Slobin and colleagues who proposed a similar approach in 1967, so a long time ago, with the aim to guide investigators in the collection of comparable cross-linguistic and cross-cultural data on the acquisition of communicative competence. And this then led to the very successful cross-linguistic study of language acquisition series, which consists of 5 volumes. And much of the cross-linguistic research in the 1980s, 1990s arose in the context of this manual and the book series it inspired. It is unfortunate that despite the promise of this earlier typologically diverse work, when we fast forward 30 years, we do not see a boom in the study of first language acquisition in typologically diverse languages in culturally different communities. This manual is forgotten, undeservedly so. It is very hard to find a copy these days. And our intention is to resurrect this idea. And on the one hand, our scope is not as ambitious as the scope of the original manual. But on the other hand, we are in a much better position than in 1967, because we can draw on the enormous advances and experience of language documentation research. So thank you, everybody, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks, Birgit. That was fantastic. I'll let you have a breather for a moment.
Thank you.
Have a glass of water. And I'll just kick things off, and while we're waiting for any questions that might come through. So if I can just take a little bit of time to sort of recap what you've been arguing. So what you've really been saying is that language diversity is a key explanandum for all branches of the language sciences. So this is not just for general linguistics or descriptive linguistics. This is for also anyone who's working with language, and that includes psycholinguistics and child language researchers. But unfortunately, psycholinguists in general haven't been very good at upholding our side of the bargain when it comes to taking language diversity seriously. So despite pioneering work by Dan Slobin and many others, so we're definitely standing on the shoulders of giants here, and all the contributors to the cross-linguistic series and beyond, our language coverage is pretty poor in the discipline. So in language acquisition, we're really at about 1.5% of languages, and adult psycholinguistics is actually much worse, to be honest. So yeah, we need to pull our socks up, as one might say. And we need a renewed focus on increasing data coverage, which has become increasingly urgent in the face of rapid language loss through rapid language endangerment and extinction. So what you've spoken about is one way to do this is to increase the breadth of language coverage by following the sketch format. And this is also something that other people have talked about as well. More recently, or other people have proposed other types of complementary approaches as well, which are also aimed at addressing this quite pressing problem in the discipline. So you sort of touched on it in the beginning, and then nicely touched on it through your talk as well. So when one of the big concerns about data, and especially corpus data over the last 20 years or so, it's probably getting longer and longer now as I'm getting older and older, but the work that went on at MPI in Leipzig, Mike Tomasello's group, and with Elena Lieven, is they were really concerned with density of corpora, because really what they were concerned with was testing theoretical models of acquisition, which is really concerned about how early something might be productive, Right. And this is really not the focus of the approach that you've spoken about. This is more about descriptive work rather than theory testing. And what you did really nicely in the talk was talk about how because you've in the really privileged position of having 5 hours of data, but then 400 hours of data as well. Well, not quite yet, but you know what I mean, that you can compare it to how well the 5 hours of data stack up to your bigger corpus. So you did that really nicely in the child-directed speech, but I was wondering with the children's speech, if you could talk more about maybe what was thrown up by the 5 hours that was consistent with what you know in your denser corpus, and maybe what things you didn't find. Probably that's related to frequency, but I guess in general, how good was the 5 hours, and where was it good and where was it bad?
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, you're right, and I think it's so my skew towards the child-directed language is simply that I've started working on child-directed language before I started working on child language. So there's much more comparable analyses available for both the sketch corpus and the longitudinal corpus. But I've now this year started looking more closely into child language, and essentially, so let's put it that way. Everything I found in the sketch corpus is attested in the larger corpus. So it didn't show anything that is not somehow an issue in child language in CARKID. So for instance, I don't know if I didn't talk about this, but I've looked a bit more closely into how object arguments are expressed in child language, because in CARKID you can either have an unmarked direct object, or you can have a prepositional object. And in the larger corpus, there's a fairly clear trajectory from omitting the prepositions, and then suddenly, slowly, prepositions coming in for some high frequency verbs, and very few errors of commission, but a few, and so they do show up in the sketch data as well, not in the high numbers as I would like to. So I'm probably wouldn't be able to draw firm conclusions about error patterns in the sketch corpus, but the general trajectory of no preposition and preposition coming slowly in with high frequency with some verbs and then shows up there. Where I found sketch data to be not enough is the subtleties of development across the 5 age points. So very often it was possible to say something about the youngest age group and about the oldest age group, but there's very likely to be much more fine-grained trajectory in between different cutoff points, and this simply isn't always captured in the sketch data, or if it's captured in the sketch data, it's not always clear. The interpretation is a bit shaky. So in some cases, I feel confident to raise some hypotheses. In other cases, I just have to say, look, 2-year-olds are doing this, 4-year-olds are doing that, and somehow they get from this what the 2-year-olds are doing to what the 4-year-olds are doing, but I can't see the intermediate steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing I was thinking about when you were talking was because I guess there has been this concern with density of data, but the two, having a dense corpus and having a sketch corpus are two different things. And I was kind of trying to think of a clever kind of analogy from real life. And it's like, would you rather, like, if you had the dense corpus is something like you've got a film of your whole childhood, and that's great. You can watch the whole thing. It takes forever. But the sketches are a snapshot or a series of snapshots. And if you had the choice of having no snapshots or some snapshots, you'd rather have a few pictures from your childhood, right? So you could at least say something about how you grew up. That's my very clunky analogy there, or metaphor.
No, definitely. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, these snapshots are much better than having nothing. And I think while doing this with the sketches, I mean, you were also there. So when we started out with the 5 hours, all of us, I think, were very skeptical about what we can do with these 5 hours. And the more we now look at the sketch data and also compare it to the larger longitudinal databases that we have for the languages where we pilot this approach, I think is very encouraging that we can say something on this basis, and we can say, at least very minimally, we can raise hypotheses, but I think we can even go further. We can say, at least in some points, some place where we do have a lot of data, we can draw some conclusions. Yes. So for instance, with the child-directed language, I can't say anything on the basis of the sketch data, how much child-directed language a child is exposed to. And this is simply because the sketch corpus is biased towards child-directed language. So which means I find a lot of child-directed language in the corpus, but I can't say anything about how representative this is for what a child hears. And I think from anthropological observations and from a larger corpus, it's not very representative. But what I can say is, in those occasions where a child is exposed to child-directed language among the car kids, these are the features that are likely to show up. And I think that's much more than nothing. Yeah,
actually, I think that that's super important as well. If you look at the things that make it into the textbooks about child-directed speech, you'd be shocked really to see that there's probably still a lot of motherese and things like that doesn't take into account the limited cross-cultural work that we have on this. So even if there was 20 sketches where we did have a whole range of different features of child-directed speech that varied cross-culturally, we'd know a lot more than what we really have at the moment, actually. And I think that in the child-directed speech, particularly in the way that you're talking about it, is really you can say quite a bit about child-directed speech. Within reason, that's for sure. So I guess one thing that is fairly clear to me, looking back over the literature, is that if we're to increase coverage of languages in the field, we need to have many different types of researchers who are doing this work as well. And so, as you said, the sketch corpus is aimed not at just child language acquisition researchers, but can be something that someone who's working on an adult language at the moment can think about adding to their documentation repertoire by filming acquisition, or 5 hours of acquisition. So as someone who started out in documentation and description primarily in adults, and then who's moved into this but is still doing documentation in adults, I guess my question is, how has that process gone for you, and how has the child-directed speech, sorry, not the child-directed speech, but the work on child language acquisition in CACET informed your description of the adult language?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I did my PhD in Nijmegen at where there was a very strong language acquisition group. And so we were exposed to a lot of talks on acquisition. And when I was there as a PhD student, I essentially said I would never ever want to do acquisition. It's way too complicated. You need too much data, and it's interesting, but sorry, not for me. And so I sort of, when I started I started working on the adult language, mainly in Africa, but then started working on CACET in Papua New Guinea, initially on the documentation of the adult language. And in the discussions with the community, when we talked about what the community would like to get out of this, there emerged that they would want to get more about the acquisition of the language, the transmission of the language to children, the acquisition with a view towards developing materials for preschool children. And so we did a small pilot study, and I was actually hooked by that then, because it was so much fun working with the children and the families. And I think the eye-opener for me was that working with the children suddenly meant that you were working with the entire community. So before, it was quite a few people who worked with me, but it was always a selected number of people. It was largely the older men who were seen as the good speakers of the language. And now with focusing on child language, the mothers came in, the younger women, and then every child has uncles and aunts and grandparents who would show up and inquire about the progress. And so suddenly there was a whole community involved, and which then meant that I learned so much more about the language, about the community, about the anthropological setup than I would have otherwise learned. And specifically by looking at the child language, so specifically a child-directed language, I'm pretty sure it would also have happened when looking at child language, but I started with child-directed language. A lot of properties of the adult language became clearer to me, especially because of this register of child-directed speech where there is more careful pronunciation. There is this repetition and the variation. So I suddenly became quite good at the routines. I've never engaged with these different routines before, and just by interacting with the children and working on child-directed language, I suddenly saw all these routines, and actually I started acquiring the language through the routines as well. So it did tell me quite a bit about the adult language, and actually specifically, so one specific phenomenon, I've touched upon this in the talk, which is the lenition of voiceless plosives in intervocalic environment, and I had which happens especially with nouns, because they're always preceded by this vowel final article. And for my lexicon, for my dictionary of Karket, I always had the problem that I never knew what the underlying plosive of a noun was, because I would always hear it in an intervocalic environment. So I never knew whether it was a lenited one or whether it was a fricative or a plosive. And it was simply impossible to elicit this information because people would always say the noun together with the noun marker. Mm-hmm. And then in the child-directed language register, I suddenly noticed that there was a natural context where adults would drop the article and the underlying plosive would surface if it was there. And then capitalized on this knowledge in my elicitation with the adults. So I would ask adults to imagine they would utter this word this noun to a child, and suddenly it was possible to get the nouns without the article and to get some idea about the underlying form of the consonant.
So then working with the child-directed speech and the child language sort of informed some of the work, or has informed your description of the language itself. Did it require a lot of upskilling though? Like I guess anything, when you're coming into a field or a related field, there are always issues that you didn't know that you have to suddenly become aware of. And I think one of the ones in particular when you're working with children's speech is transcription, and how to transcribe what the children are saying, and then making sure that people who are transcribing it are not correcting it, because you really want what the children are saying rather than what the adult form is. So did you come across difficulties in, like, first of all, I guess, understanding those issues and just becoming aware of them, and then dealing with those issues in the field too?
Yeah, definitely. It's I mean, in retrospect, I think it's both more difficult and easier to transcribe child language. So it's more difficult because half of the time you have no clue what the child is trying to say, and also so we were trying to work with the parents or with close relatives of the child who knows the child well and can interpret a little bit what the child might have said. But even for them, it's often very, very difficult, and you suddenly have to. And it took me a while to realize that there's quite a bit of information in the data itself. So actually, one of the things which makes it easier to transcribe child language is the repetition. So if there's 20 repetitions of a word and 15 you might not be able to understand, but there is bound to be one repetition that is very clear, plus it's context dependent. So the child might point at something and suddenly it becomes clear what they're talking about. And then you can guess what the other non-intelligible 15 repetitions might have meant. Mm-hmm. Another thing is the reaction of interlocutors, which in theory, one should pay attention to it also when analyzing adult language, but it's often not so much necessary because it's clearer what the adult tries to say. But with the child language, it becomes very essential, and also it's now second nature to me to check what the interlocutors are doing, how they're responding, which again gives us information about what the child might have said.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, having said this, there's still an awful lot amount of data, but the utterances that a child says that are simply remain unintelligible. And I mean, the other issue that you mentioned, that adults tend to give the adult version instead of what the child said. It's I think this is happening quite a lot, and it's actually interesting, and they came to learn to appreciate this because it sort of gives us an idea of what the target form would have been or should have been. Again, you have to exercise caution how you interpret this, but there is at least the adult transcriber is supplying some of the morphology, some information that they think are missing from the child's utterance. And it's another interesting research topic actually to look at what the transcribers are supplying, and they're supplying some really interesting systematic changes. So there's, for instance, one transcriber who regularly writes both the underlying plosive and the lenited plosive, so both the phoneme and the allophone, which I find very interesting because it also tells us something about the metalinguistic knowledge that adult speakers have about their language. And there's some other recurrent patterns. So it's actually would be, I haven't gotten around to this, but I think it would be a nice thing to analyze what exactly the transcribers are changing and to detect the patterns there and draw conclusions about the knowledge, the metalinguistic knowledge of the adults.
Yeah, wow. Okay. So now I'll just change tack a little bit here and ask a kind of philosophical question, or ask you to peer into your crystal ball. What if we don't increase coverage, right? So I guess the thing about, so you put that figure up from our paper about the language coverage in the field that we've just finished, and it really is kind of encouraging in the sense that we're getting better, but it's still depressing because it's a very slow rate. And I think if you go back to some of Dan Slobin's, one of the cross-linguistic volumes, and then in another paper in Journal of Child Language, he shows that there's kind of a linear trend in maybe like 1 or 2 new languages a year we add to the field. Now, I guess someone like you who's worked on a dazzlingly diverse range of languages and is in a really good position to comment on the nature and the depth of linguistic diversity and what it means for general theories of language, and what it means also if we don't account for that. Now, on the other side of that, there's also many people who work in the field who would argue that actually a lot of this diversity is very surface level and doesn't reflect sort of core underlying properties of the language faculty. So but at the same time, I think that we are all really we all really have to account in some way for the diversity, and this has to be incorporated into our theories. So what happens if we don't increase coverage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the central question, right? I mean, just basically, if we don't increase coverage, we'll never know what's universal and what's not. So, I mean, that's put as simple as that, right? Because on the basis of a small sample of languages, we won't be able to tease apart what's universal and what's language specific. So, but for more specific examples, I think we just have to look into the history of the cross-linguistic research on language acquisition, right? So when we I mean, the example that's always quoted is the acquisition of the passive, right? Which on the basis of English data was assumed to be acquired quite late. And then there was data, information, analysis from a few other languages, and I think it was mainly Sesotho, so a Bantu language that Catherine DeMuth worked on, and I think Inuktitut also was involved, which Shanley Allen and colleagues worked on. And they could show that know that the fact that the passive is acquired so late in English has nothing to do with the inherent difficulty of passive, the cognitive difficulty of producing a passive. It has something to do with frequency. It has something to do with the structure, the morphology of the passive. So I think that's the a very, very clear example where we would have missed out if we hadn't had the data from more diverse languages. And a more recent example is from child-directed language. So we know from these variation sets that are introduced where adults keep the message constant, but they introduce varied repetitions, and all the data, available data, shows that these variation sets are very frequent when children are young, and it's becoming less frequent as children become older. And so there's still currently research going on, and it's not completely definite yet, but there are indications that in polysynthetic languages, we see the opposite pattern. We see an increase in frequency as the children become older. And again, that's something where we urgently need more data on, more information on, because this is not predicted on the basis of what we know about these variation sets from Western languages. And so I think it's, I mean, they're just two examples, but I think it maybe sketches a little bit what we lose out if we don't increase coverage. And if we don't increase it very soon, because I mean, the other point that I haven't talked about today at all is the endangerment of the world's languages, and especially of the many small under-researched languages in remote regions of this world. And so what we don't do now, we may not be able to do in 50 years' time, 60 years' time.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I think actually, when you go back to some of those papers by, especially the book series by Slobin, and then also a lot of Melissa Bauman's writings as well, it's slightly, it's a shame, I suppose, that people really haven't picked up on that in the meantime, and really taken off, like that kind of lament that you had by Barb Kelly and Rachel Nordlinger in your talk, which said, you know, it's this really people haven't really carried the torch here, and it's really time to start concentrating on increasing this coverage, so that, because it really is, as people like Clifton Pye have also said, it really is the last chance that we have for many of these languages, almost half of them, right? So yeah. No,
I agree. And I mean, and I think we're in a good position these days, right? I mean, with the advances of technology, that's another thing that easy to use video recording, audio recording hasn't been around for that long. And I think maybe now is really, and also when you look at the different approaches, right? So Sabine Stoll with her active project, the day-long recordings, Clifton Pye with this very recent proposal on the toolkit, us with the sketch format. It seems that at the moment there's a lot of different people essentially trying to find a solution to the same problem of increasing coverage. And I agree, it's a pity that it comes so late, but I'm not sure how much earlier we could have really started on that.
And of course, with the advent of things like day-long recordings, like Marissa Casillas and Alex Christia are using, and hopefully what will come with that is also automated transcription to a degree anyway, which would really speed up that transcription bottleneck, which is so difficult in all of the things that we do.
I mean, minimally, this with the day-long recordings, this possibility to identify whether it's a child speaker or an adult speaker talking to the child, which can be done automatically to some extent in some languages, and I think this would already help a lot once this can be used reliably for languages other than English. And I think chances are pretty good that with the advances in information technology, this is bound to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, which kind of also suggests that actually going and doing recording more than maybe you can transcribe might be a good idea, because hopefully one day you may well get to it. or it may your job might be easier.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't have any more questions, and there's nothing coming through, so I think we could probably leave it there. So I'll take the opportunity to thank you, Birgit, for an excellent talk, and I'll thank everyone who's come to listen and who will be listening at whatever date and time in the future on YouTube, and we'll say goodbye.
Thank you, Evan, for the nice moderation, nice discussion, and thanks a lot to everybody, to the organizers and the audience, and yeah, hope to see everybody at some point again.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.